Welcome to Vanadium. Mysteries. We're here again, and I have to bring you a really interesting story that I have not seen covered in any of the podcasts that I watch. And I'm a fan of conspiracy, paranormal, assorted, scary podcasts. And I've never come across anybody discussing this, but this is something that I've actually known about for many years. And it's something called the PEAR Project. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab. And it was existed at Princeton University for about 30 years until about 2007, when it was shut down. And it produced a lot of really interesting work, much of which is undisputed to this day. It was run by a fellow called Robert Jahn. Robert Jahn was one of those scientists who was not just constrained by the usual type of bureaucratic and social crap that a lot of other scientists are. He was really somebody who was in just for the game of discovery. He was an inspiration. And I first learned about him when I was younger. I grew up not far from Princeton University. And this guy, I actually used to ride my bike, and I remember passing by where this lab was. I don't remember actually ever seeing the lab. Robert Jahn, he had this idea of, and the lab really proved this idea of a man and a person, man or woman, machine interaction, a connection between a living thing, a person, and a complex apparatus, a complex process. What this research lab shows is there's an interconnection in the universe that goes way beyond what we would perceive. And it's going to have to, the effects that they were able to show conclusively are not, no one really even argues about it. I mean, there are a few skeptics that point their fingers and maybe the scientists were actually cheating. But really, no one, I think those people have really been disproven, and I don't think I think they've looked into it, and they haven't ever really shown any impropriety in the fact, at the hands of the researchers or anybody involved in the experiments. And they were funded for quite a long time, doing stuff that I imagine they had to justify fairly regularly to their supporters. And it was pretty well-functioning lab. And they produced a lot of stuff over the years. And I'll show you some of this stuff. Problem is they weren't able to have a seance where they talked to Napoleon, or were able to do like Bill and Ted and bring back like Socrates and, other historical and important figures to come, give their perspective. It was less dramatic than that, unfortunately. But what they showed, really, at the core of the experiment was something called a random number generator. And they had a few different ways that they created randomness. And they did it with electronics and also with mechanical devices. And I'll show you some pictures of these. So one was as simple as just dropping balls from a height, and they actually get bounced around by a series of pegs, something you'd see at like a carnival game. And these balls would rearrange in a random order. And they would look at the spread of this distribution. They'd keep doing these random exercises, and they would look to see over time, would the results differ from randomness? Would they ever start to show a trend? And there were times and instances where they did show trends. And they repeated these experiments thousands and thousands of times. And they were able to show that these things didn't repeat every time, but repeated enough so that it couldn't be just chance. And this relates to something you may hear in some of the media, but something called the p-value. And that's something I can go into a little bit. But that's basically the p-value is the chances that a scientist is fooling himself or is funding people, his donors, the people that are paying him or her. And p-value is the chance that your experiment just gave you results that would just happen by chance. And that you set up something and you discovered something that's really not in effect. It's just maybe just luck that you observed this effect that you think you're seeing, but it's not real and you likely won't be able to repeat it. So that's having a low p-value is something you really want. And these experiments showed consistently low p-values, and that means that they were really careful about the way they did their experiments and examined and analyzed with statistics. And the conclusions they made were not very exciting to a layperson. But even to me at the time, I really didn't understand it, and it took me some time. I was sort of like, wow, they have a lab that does this? But it took it took really becoming an engineer and working. It was an engineering anomalies research lab. It's in the name itself. They're not hunting ghosts. What they're looking for are there effects of the human mind on devices, really complex devices. We're not talking just wheels and springs. We're talking about really complex electronics and mechanical devices. Turns out, yeah, it really seems to have that effect. And the guy that headed the lab, and really the reason why the lab, I think, sort of slowed down is because Robert Jahn, the mastermind, the architect of the lab, really slowed down himself. And he's sadly not with us anymore. And he died in 2017. And the work that he did is largely undisputed. And the ideas behind it are even more exciting than if he did find a ghost, or he did produce some kind of fucking spirit or some future prediction. It's really it's more interesting than something that sort of cliched. What he showed, what his experiments and what 30 years and thousands, maybe 1 million different separate experiments. He has a staff of hundreds over the years, all working toward the same goal and consistently achieving the same goal. And that is to show that the human mind is doing things in the environment. The human mind is shaping reality, at least in part, and in ways that we just never would have thought, and we're probably only just touching on. And it's going to take a little bit of, you have to wrap your mind around some of this stuff, and it's not that exciting. But if you really think about it, and think about the implications of it, think about what it means that the way you feel is not just completely separate and meaningless. Think about that life is more than just, what meets the eye. It's not materialism. By materialism, I don't mean material girl, like in a Madonna type sense. I mean materialism as in, Richard Dawkins. I think that he would even call himself a materialist. I'm a material scientist, not a materialist. A materialist is somebody who believes that basically life and basically all the effects that we're able to observe can be basically broken down to their component parts that were made up of cells, which are made up of sort of basic chemicals, amino acids, and it gets down to basic chemical reactions that run everything and give rise to everything: human history, inspiration, the idea of God, love, ambition, war, hate, discovery. The fact that we were able to realize that or even have that idea. Frankly, it's absurd. And I think that it's plainly absurd to really anybody who doesn't get their mind twisted up studying science instead of doing it. And Robert Jahn is one of those guys who, he even had his doubts at the beginning, but he looked at the evidence as it came in. And he was somebody who wasn't afraid to look at something and look at these effects objectively. And he also wasn't afraid to report on it and deal with a lot of public scorn. I mean, you wouldn't believe some of the things that were said about this lab and this work. I went on the Wikipedia page, and I'm getting less impressed with that web page over time. I'll just leave it at that. So the lab focused on a number of things over the years. Not just the random number generators. They worked with electronics random systems and mechanical random systems, but another thing that they went into was remote viewing. And the idea of a Stargate. Well, not really that. Really mostly remote viewing. And it is some really fascinating stuff. They did the least amount of work with remote viewing because I think that there were some people who were interested in that maybe took some of that research and didn't make it available to the public. Now, that's just a theory on my part. I'm just speculating. But I just wanted to read something. I don't know how many of the Vanadium audience is familiar with a guy called Wernher von Braun. Really the inventor of rockets, really. He was a Nazi that we brought over here in Operation Paperclip, and he had some interesting things to say. He was a guy who started off being an atheist when he was young, sort of eschewing or just denouncing the idea of God. And I just have some interesting quotes on him from Mr. von Braun. He was a guy that he's not admirable in every way, considering I believe that, he took active part in the Holocaust. And at his rocket factory, they executed, I think a Jewish person every day. Though the person they claimed was, I guess, the laziest person at the factory, they would just kill every day at his factory. And he never, whether or not he, played the guitar while they did it or just stood by, I don't think either way. I think Mr. von Braun started to believe in God. Maybe he should have been developing a little bit of fear, but I don't know whether he did at the end or not. But listen to some of these quotes. One cannot be exposed to the law and order of the universe without concluding there must be design and purpose behind it all. I think that says a lot. My experiences with science led me to God. They challenged science to prove the existence of God. But must we really light a candle to see the sun? That's an interesting quote. So he sort of says what I say, that the idea that there's something behind it is really plainly obvious. And people like Richard Dawkins, his ideas, and I think the man himself, are not aging very well. I mean, he's sort of just a belligerent blowhard. And I'm sorry to people that are his fans. You may not remain fans of the Vanadium podcast show for very long. But that's all right. We can lose you. I don't find him to be... I don't doubt that he's tremendously intelligent. And he has some great titles to his books. I know I'm not doubting his intellect or his faculties in any way, shape, or form. What I'm doubting is I think he's very angry at the world. I think he hates people. My theory. Or maybe I'm projecting a little bit. I don't know. I don't think I really hate people. But anyway, he just seems like a nasty son of a bitch, just my opinion. And I don't like what he has to say. He's what I would like to call a reductionist, which is to me is somebody who spends a lot of time just like thinking about how people just cause a lot of problems and just talking all day about people and their problems instead of doing something actually productive. So I see him maybe talking a lot and maybe writing books, but and writing a book is doing something. But I don't know how much work he's actually doing in the lab. I don't know how much analysis of data he's actually doing day to day, or when's the last time he really did anything like that. So, not a big fan. I'm not a big fan of that bow tie bastard either. I'll leave his name out of it. I'm not even going to give him the fucking plug. And why are scientists so threatened and so dismissive of these things? I have my theories. And they go beyond just the usual conspiracy theories. And the whole idea is that it's disconcerting and upsetting to scientists, and they want to reject these notions and the fact that these strange outliers, these anomalies exist, because it's kind of threatening to their intellect, because it's baffling. And threatening the intellect kind of is a sensation I kind of like. But when people are being used to being the smartest person and always knowing the answers to everything, sometimes when they're confronted with something that baffles them, they prefer to pretend that it doesn't exist. And I think that's a lot of what's behind this. It's not necessarily things that are nefarious, but I think it's a real problem. And I think it's one of the problems that it's given rise to the public kind of rejecting science and scientists a little bit. The whole flat Earth. So I'll just add that. I'll just leave that as all the evidence I need. Something ain't right. And there's no reason for all this hatred and skepticism of scientists, really. Except that it's the attitude and the way that they communicate and treat the public, I think, is kind of a problem. And I think the way the media portrays scientists is also a problem. But scientists have to get better at communicating. And they have to get better at not being afraid of stuff they don't know. And not being afraid of changing their minds and being wrong. Because you know what? You will be wrong. If you're going to do anything, you're going to be wrong sometimes. You're going to fail. And running away from that and hiding from it, I guess, is not just a problem for scientists. That's a problem for everybody. But, it's an easier said than done to solve that little problem. I know, I admit. But that's, I think, one of the core problems that I think need to be addressed in science communication and with science educators. Because I feel, I'm an insider to this whole thing, but I get why people really dislike the attitude of somebody like Richard Dawkins. It's infuriating. He's the way he talks about people, the way he has no appreciation of really of human nature, the animal that he is. Interesting. No, so there's a lot of darkness in scientists, and you could say I've heard others. I've talked to other scientists about this, and they'll say it's because we're sort of on the margins of society. Kind of interesting. I never really felt like that, but I guess I don't know. Maybe there's something to it, but that's no reason to. That's no reason to just think that you're inherently better than the people you're trying to communicate to, because that ain't gonna work. In Vanadium Mysteries, the investigation into this phenomenon, into this project, would not be complete without mentioning Dr. Roger Nelson of the Global Consciousness Project. So he has taken this a step further. He was part of PEAR originally, and he's still working today. And his whole thing is he's taken the whole thing of the random number generators and taken the whole phenomenon global. So he has them stashed in numerous sites around the world, and he looks at how do these random distributions change over time and with certain events. So it turns out that during certain cataclysmic world events, such as 9/11, there have been changes in the random number distributions. So that's been, I'll give you an address to his website. Some really interesting stuff. It's worth checking out. Special message to the Vanadium audience before we conclude for the day. There is some major fuckery going on out there, people. It's pretty scary out there. So I want everybody to stay safe and everybody to keep their head up. And I know that evil and the forces of fuckery are on the march, but we need to stay strong through this, and we're going to get through it together. And there's going to be a lot of good that comes through this, and there's a lot of going to be some fucking heroes. They're going to shine through all of this, and we have to find them, we have to support them, and we have to do our best to take care of one another. And we have to keep these some of this human filth from spoiling things worse than they already have, and they're fucking everywhere. And I don't even need to explain to the Vanadium audience, but this has been a special message, and I won't belabor my point, but I hope you enjoyed the program today and learned something about the PEAR Institute, and I hope that everybody has a good weekend, and you can put some of this horse shit on the back burner and have a little fucking fun. So this is Vanadium. Have a great day.